Snow closed every road out of Greystone Flats that night, and what happened next would save the town or bury it under 4 feet of white. Montana Territory, the winter of 1887, the year they called the Great Die-Up, the year the cattle froze standing where they grazed, and entire families just disappeared. And it was on the worst night of that worst winter that a lone rider came in off the North Fork Trail, ice crusted along the brim of his hat, and asked for a room. He got one. He also got something nobody in Greystone Flats had managed in 18 months. He got rid of Silas Vane. And what came after? The way a quiet saloon-keeper named Maren Ault walked out from behind her bar and told a stranger she'd been waiting for someone like him, and the way he almost didn't stay, and the way both of them together brought down the whole Vane outfit before spring, that story is worth sitting still for, partner. So, settle in. Before we go further, drop a like on this one if you're enjoying the channel, and tell me down below where you're watching from tonight. I always read those. Now, back to Greystone Flats. Back to the night the snow changed everything. You need to understand what that winter was, before the rest of this makes the kind of sense it should. The Great Die-Up of 1886 to 1887 was not an exaggeration. The ranchers who survived it, and not all of them did, described a cold that crept in not like weather, but like an occupation. It came in November, and it never left. Stock that were already thin from a dry summer hit the first hard freeze in poor shape, and by December the rivers were locked under ice so thick that teams couldn't break through to water. January brought temperatures that broke thermometers, then broke the replacement thermometers too. On the open range, cattle by the tens of thousands simply stopped walking and stood still until there were snow, and the men who went out to bring them in sometimes didn't come back. In spring, when the rivers finally ran, the carcasses jammed the banks for miles, and the smell carried for 20 more. Stockmen who'd been wealthy in October were ruined by April, and an entire era of the open-range cattle business died in that single winter, quietly and absolutely. That was the world Greystone Flats sat inside. Not a hardship, but a siege. Not the kind of siege where the enemy shoots at you, but the kind where everything familiar just slowly stops working, and you learn what you're actually made of by what you're still willing to do when nothing makes it easy. The town sat in a bowl between 2 ridges on the Missouri River's eastern fork, and in good weather it was easy to miss. 230 people, maybe 40 left by that January. The rest had gone after the first hard freeze, loading their wagons while they still could, pointing south toward the railroad towns and not looking back. What stayed behind was a hardware store, a livery, a barber shop that doubled as a dentist, a dry goods owned by a man named O.K. Pelletier, who kept the only locked cabinet of firearms in town, and the Double Arch Saloon. The Double Arch was Maren Ault's, had been her father's before her, and before that nobody's, just a plank floor and some nails in the wall where men hung their coats. Her father had built it up into something real over the course of 30 years, and when he died the previous spring, she'd stepped behind the bar and hadn't stepped out since. She was 26 years old, dark-haired, with sharp green eyes and a way of watching a room that made people uncomfortable if they hadn't earned her trust. Most of the men in Greystone Flats hadn't. Silas Vane had moved in the summer before. He came with 8 riders and a lawyer from Helena, and papers he claimed gave him mineral rights to the entire eastern ridge. Nobody in Greystone Flats had ever seen those papers actually read out loud by anyone neutral, and the lawyer from Helena left after 2 days and never came back. Which told you something. What the papers actually gave Silas Vane, in practice, was an excuse to put 2 of his riders at the bridge and charge tolls on anything moving in or out of the valley. Timber, cattle, grain, the mail. He took a cut of everything, and if you pushed back, one of his men would pay you a visit at closing time and explain the situation more concretely. By January of 1887, he had 11 riders. A few were hard cases hired for the purpose. Most were drifters and former ranch hands who'd needed winter work, and hadn't asked enough questions before signing on. They bunked in the old Calder feed warehouse at the north end of town, which Vane had bought for $40 from a widow who needed the money badly enough not to argue. They ate at the Double Arch most nights because it was warm, and because Vane told them to, which meant Maren Ault had to serve them, and she did, because refusing would have cost her the building. She served them, and she watched them, and she wrote down everything she saw. Before we talk about the ledger, it's worth saying a word about who Maren Ault was, because the story has a habit of making the drifter the whole thing, and that's not right. He was part of it. She was the engine. She'd grown up inside the Double Arch, done her schoolwork at that same bar counter, listened to 30 years of other people's stories through the plank floor of her bedroom above the main room. Her father, a man named Jonas Ault, had been careful and quiet and completely unmovable. The kind of man who told you once where the line was, and then never bothered telling you again. She had his eyes and his stubbornness and his habit of silence, and she'd been watching people across that bar for long enough that she could read a room the way some people read a printed page, quickly, without effort, retaining the important parts. When Vane moved in, she'd known inside the first week what kind of man he was. The kind who mistakes patience for weakness and takes careful people for fools. He'd been genial at first, buying rounds for his men, making remarks about the weather and the hard times, and how a woman running a place like this all alone must find it a challenge, said with the particular brand of condescension that implies the speaker could solve the problem if only asked nicely. She'd smiled and poured his whiskey and started the ledger that same night, writing the first entry in the back corner of the stockroom while his men's voices carried through the wall. 18 months later, 62 pages. She was thorough, because she understood that half evidence gets dismissed and whole evidence gets acted on, and that a woman bringing a complaint needed twice the documentation a man did to be taken seriously by any court in the territory. She didn't waste energy being angry about that. She just accounted for it and wrote it down. Twice. That was the thing about Maren Ault that nobody in Greystone Flats knew, except old Elias Drum, who ran the livery and was the closest thing the town had to a law-minded man. She kept a ledger. Not a financial ledger, though. She kept those, too. A different kind. A black-covered journal she'd started the week after Vane's riders roughed up old Gus Fenner for trying to drive his lumber wagon out of the valley without paying the toll. Names, dates, descriptions. The exact words men said when they thought nobody was listening. The name of the rancher east of town, Bill Draper, whose cattle Vane's men had run off a creek crossing and drowned, and the date it happened, and the names of 2 witnesses who'd seen it from a hilltop. The threats, the extorted payments, the mule Vane's man Cord Jessup had shot in the middle of the road for sport, and who owned it, and what it was worth. 18 months of crimes, documented in a woman's careful handwriting, stacked in tight columns on 62 pages of ledger paper. The problem was getting it out. The 2 men on the bridge weren't just there for the tolls. They searched bags. They turned back 3 people Maren had quietly asked to carry it, and the last one, a young schoolteacher named Hetty Rourke, had come back with a bruised arm and a look in her eyes that told Maren it was time to try a different approach. She needed someone who could put those 2 men on the bridge out of the equation long enough for a runner to get through. Someone who could handle what came after. She'd been waiting for a long time. He came in at 9 in the evening on the 15th of January, tied his horse at the rail outside the Double Arch, the only building still showing lamplight, and pushed through the door like a man who was used to pushing through doors that might have trouble on the other side. He was tall and lean, somewhere in his early 30s, with a weathered face that looked like it had been left outside a few winters too many. Brown coat, trail-worn, a single-action Colt on his right hip, worn low and tied down. The leather of the holster worked smooth with use. He didn't look like trouble, which meant he was. He asked for a room. Maren told him the rate. He counted out the coins without looking at them, which told her he'd done it 10,000 times. He asked what they had to eat. She told him beans and cornbread. He said that'd do fine. He sat down at a table near the back wall, the way a careful man sits, back to the wall, angle on the door. The room had 4 other occupants: Elias Drum at the bar nursing a whiskey, 2 of Vane's riders playing cards at the center table, and Silas Vane himself in the corner booth, which he'd taken over as his personal seat so completely that nobody else ever sat in it anymore. Vane was watching the stranger the way a dog watches something it hasn't decided about yet. He was a compact man in his mid-40s, with a neat gray beard and small light eyes that moved around a room too quickly. He dressed better than his surroundings, which he seemed to consider a point in his favor. He let the stranger eat most of his beans before he said anything. What he said was the kind of thing men like him say when they want to establish who runs things. A casual remark about new arrivals checking in with the management. A reference to the toll arrangements. The smile that didn't reach those quick-light eyes. The stranger set down his fork. He looked at Vane for a moment with a kind of stillness that wasn't comfortable to watch. Then he said he didn't recall asking for a guide to local customs. Vane said that was fine, but it'd be worth this fella's time to get familiar. The stranger said he appreciated the concern. Then Vane reached for the gun on his hip, which was one of those decisions that look obvious in hindsight. What happened next took less than 4 seconds. Less than 3 if you were counting carefully. Maren Ault had seen fast draws before. Her father's saloon had that history to it, unavoidably, but she had never seen anything like this. The man's hand moved the way light moves when a cloud breaks. There was the motion, and then there was the result, and the gap between them was too small to hold a breath. Silas Vane never cleared leather. He hit the floorboards with a surprised look of a man who had just discovered a serious error in his arithmetic. The saloon was very quiet. The stranger holstered his gun the same way he'd drawn it, smooth, without theater, the way a craftsman puts a tool back on his belt. He picked up his fork and finished his beans. One of the card-playing riders started to stand up. The stranger looked at him. The rider sat back down. Elias Drum at the bar put his whiskey glass down very carefully, as though this was a moment for precision. It was Maren Ault who broke the silence. She walked out from behind the bar, looked down at Silas Vane for a long moment and said, in a voice that was remarkably steady, "Somebody's going to need to go get Reverend Casterly." The stranger looked at her. She looked at him. Something passed between them that wasn't exactly warmth and wasn't exactly caution. More like recognition. "The rest of his men," she said, speaking quietly now so only he could hear, "there are 9 more. They're camped at a ranch about 6 miles east. They'll hear about this by morning and they'll be here by nightfall, unless the storm closes the canyon trail first." She glanced at the window, where the snow was coming down like it meant to bury everything. Right now, there's still a way out. One man on a fast horse going south on the river ice could make it through Perdition Canyon before it drifts closed. You could be in Gallatin City before those 9 know you exist. The stranger was quiet for a moment. He was looking at his coffee cup. "That'd be the smart play," he said. "It would," Maren agreed. He turned the cup in his hands. Outside the window the wind had picked up, a sound like something tearing. The snow was coming harder. "You said right now," he said. "Before it drifts closed." "I said that. How long's right now last?" She looked at the window again. "An hour. Maybe less." He nodded slowly. He drank his coffee. He set the cup down. "Tell me about those 9 men," he said. Maren Ault pulled out a chair and sat across from him, and she talked for a long time. She told him about the 9 riders at the Draper Ranch east of town, the ranch they'd effectively seized after running Bill Draper out the previous fall. She told him that of those 9, she figured 3 were genuine hard men who'd stay loyal to the outfit regardless. Cord Jessup, who was the worst of them, and who'd been with Vane since before he came to Montana, a young killer named Trace, who'd shot a man in Butte the year before and ridden north because the law was close behind, and a third man whose real name nobody knew but who they called Doby, built like a wagon axle, quiet as weather. The other 6 were more complicated. 3 were local ranch hands who'd signed on for winter wages when their outfits folded in the freeze. 2 were trail drifters who'd been heading south and gotten snowed in. 1 was a boy barely 19 who'd made a bad decision in October and hadn't found a way out of it yet. 4 of those 6 have been looking for an exit since Vane stopped paying regular, Maren said. I've had quiet conversations. I know which ones. The stranger looked at her with something close to respect. You've been working on this. 18 months, she said. I've had time. She told him about the ledger then. She set it on the table between them and watched him turn through the pages, his eyes moving with the careful attention of someone who reads a situation, not just words. He stopped at a few entries, read them twice. He closed it. This is enough to hang 3 men and prison the rest, he said. That's my read too, she said. You need to get it to the marshal. The territorial one? Not a county badge. Territorial jurisdiction covers the mineral rights fraud. I know. The route's the problem. Vame had men on the bridge. I had 3 attempts fail. The bridge is 6 feet of water right now. Frozen solid. A man on foot could cross the ice 50 yards upstream. Your canyon fords ice too this cold. Somebody who knows where the river runs, with that ledger wrapped in oilskin, could be through Perdition Canyon before those riders ever saddle up in the morning. Maren nodded slowly. There's a freighter. Elias knows him. An old packer named Gideon Cross. He knows every inch of the river between here and Gallatin City. He's been making that run for 20 years. He went out 3 days ago to ride out the storm at his line shack in the canyon, which means he's already on the other side of the worst stretch. Then he's already past the drift, the stranger said. He'd come back for this, Maren said. If I sent word through Elias, Gideon Cross is the kind of man who'd come back for this. The stranger was quiet for a moment. He looked at the window. The snow outside had gone from heavy to something beyond heavy, the kind that erases the difference between sky and ground. And even as they watched, the lamplight from the window caught the drift building against the south wall of the building across the street. The canyon trail's closed, he said. It wasn't a question. Closed, she agreed. About 20 minutes ago. There was a pause. So, he said. So, she said. He looked down at the ledger. He looked up at the window. He picked up his coffee cup and found it empty and set it back down. He said, I'll need to know the layout of the town. Maren Ault allowed herself one single moment of something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite hope. Then she stood up and went back behind the bar and started drawing him a second cup of coffee. And she talked. It's worth taking a moment here to tell you about Greystone Flats itself, partner. The people who were left in it, and why they'd stayed. 40 people in a valley in the middle of the worst winter in Montana's recorded history. You might wonder what kind of person does that when leaving was still an option. The answer is, the kind who had no better option. There was Elias Drum, 70 years old, who'd run the livery for 30 of them, and whose mule operation was the only one in the valley that still had any animals left alive. Elias had nowhere to go that could use a 70-year-old liveryman. He'd said as much to anyone who asked. He had a loaded Henry rifle behind the stable door, and a dog named Packer, and he'd outlived harder winters than this one, he said, though privately he wasn't sure about that. There was O.K. Pelletier, who ran the dry goods, a wide, soft-spoken man from Quebec who'd been here 16 years and whose French was still better than his English. Oak had a wife, Sylvie, and 2 daughters under 10, and he'd stayed because Sylvie had been sick in the fall and wasn't fit to travel, and by the time she was better, the road was gone. He kept the firearms cabinet locked and checked it twice a day, which told you something about his state of mind. There was Reverend Casterly, who was 72 and walked with a cane, and whose congregation had gone from 54 families to 6, and who held services every Sunday morning for whoever showed up, which was usually Elias Drum and Oak's wife Sylvie, and a few of the old-timers who didn't know what else to do on a Sunday. Reverend Casterly had a way of talking about hard times that didn't make them sound like God's punishment, which was rare among men of his profession, and had earned him more loyalty from Greystone Flats than any amount of preaching. There was the Fenner family, old Gus, who'd been roughed up by Vane's riders that first summer, and his daughter-in-law Clara and her 2 boys, 8 and 10, who'd stayed because their wagon axle broke, and by the time Gus got it fixed, the October freeze had come early, and it was too late. The boys had taken to spending time at the livery, mostly to get away from their grandfather's complaints about the axle, and Elias Drum had taught them to play cards, which Gus did not consider an improvement. These were the people who were left. Not heroes, not fighters, people who'd been slow or unlucky or too sick or too old, people with nowhere better to be. Silas Vane's men had moved through them for 18 months like weather moves through a valley, taking what it wanted, leaving damage behind, going about its business with the absolute indifference of something that doesn't think of itself as cruel, because it doesn't think of its victims as quite real. The 2 men on the bridge had been Vane's toll collectors. Now there were no men on the bridge, because Cord Jessup had recalled them to the Draper Ranch when the blizzard closed in. A small mercy. The warehouse at the north end was empty. Vane's riders slept at the Draper Ranch during the bad cold, and only rode into town when there was business, which meant that by the morning after Vane died, Greystone Flats had a temporary, fragile quiet. The stranger used it. He spent most of that night with Maren Ault, going through the ledger entry by entry, learning the names and patterns of the 9 riders the way a military man studies a map. He asked questions. How were they armed? Who had horses in fighting shape? How did they communicate with each other? He asked about the physical layout of town, measuring distances in his head, walking the length of the main street twice in the blowing dark to fix the geometry. He was methodical in a way that wasn't military and wasn't law. It was something older and more personal than either. Around midnight, Elias Drum came back from the livery, where he'd gone to think things through. He sat down at the bar, accepted a whiskey from Maren, and looked at the stranger for a long moment. "I know what you are," Elias said. The stranger waited. "My brother ran a stage line out of Abilene in 69, 60-10. He told me about a man who worked trouble off the Cimarron Trail, worked alone, didn't take a badge, didn't take a bounty, just worked. My brother said you could tell him by the fact that he never talked more than he had to, and he always sat with his back to the wall." The stranger was quiet for a moment. "Your brother's got a good memory," he said. "He dead now," Elias said without apparent emotion. "Died in 73. But he talked about that man on the Cimarron enough that I never forgot. He drank his whiskey. He looked out at the dark and the snow. I'll do what I can," Elias said. "I got the Henry. I can put the Fenner boys somewhere safe. Oak's got his cabinet locked, but he'll open it if I ask." The stranger nodded once. "There's a thing that happens to a man when he's been carrying a particular weight for a long time, and somebody finally sees it clearly enough to not pretend it isn't there." Elias Drum had named what the stranger was without flinching from it, and the stranger had accepted that naming without apology or explanation. That was a kind of honesty that happens rarely between men in this narrator's experience, and when it does, it tends to matter. Now is a good time to stop for a moment, folks, and remind you that if you like where this story's going, the best thing you can do is subscribe to the channel. New stories every week. Same style, same attention to the real history underneath the fiction. And if you've made it this far into the night at Greystone Flats, tell me in the comments what you think is coming. Because even I'll admit, what happened over the next 48 hours surprised me, and I already knew how it ended. Now, back to Montana territory, back to the blizzard, back to the drifter who didn't ride south when he had the chance. They sent word to Gideon Cross through a method that would have seemed absurd in any other winter. Old Elias had a system for communicating with Gideon when the trail was closed, developed over years of partnership in the freighting business, a series of signal fires at fixed points along the canyon rim, each one meaning something specific, visible from the line shack if Gideon happened to look north at the right time. 3 fires close together meant emergency. A single fire held for 10 minutes meant wait for a runner. They built the signal fires on the canyon rim in the storm, which was a miserable business. And then Elias sat in the livery watching the line shack window through his spyglass for 3 hours before a light appeared and blinked 3 times. Gideon Cross had his answer. What Gideon Cross didn't have was the ledger yet. That had to wait until the canyon ford was passable, which in the deep cold meant waiting for the wind to drop, which it did, briefly, improbably, around 2 in the morning. In that 2-hour window, Maren wrapped the ledger in 3 layers of oilskin, tied it with waxed cord, and gave it to a boy named Arnie Fenner, the older of the 2 Fenner boys, 10 years old, who had taken one look at the situation and volunteered with a calm that alarmed every adult in the room. She talked him through the route 3 times. The river ford, the ice shelf on the western bank, the path to the lion shack door. Elias Drum walked him to the edge of the canyon trail and watched him go, and then came back to the saloon and sat down with the air of a man who has done something that can't be undone. "He'll be all right," Maren said. "He's a steady kid," Elias agreed. He didn't say anything else about it. Arnie Fenner made it. He made it across the frozen ford and up the western bank and to the line shack, where Gideon Cross opened the door before he knocked. The old freighter had been watching through the window. Cross read the note Maren had written. He looked at the ledger. He said 4 words that the boy remembered exactly. "I'll have it there." And then Cross left before dawn, heading south with the oilskin package inside his coat, moving along the river canyon by routes that only a man who'd been making that run for 20 years could navigate in a blizzard. He was 3 days out from Gallatin City when the drifters' fight happened. The marshal's telegraph reached Helena 11 hours after Cross arrived. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. Here is what the drifter did with those 48 hours. He set the town up the way a man sets up a position he's going to defend. Not a fort, he had no illusions about building walls against 9 armed riders. What he built was a series of choices. Places where Vane's men would want to go, and places they wouldn't. Sightlines, choke points. He spoke privately with each of the remaining townspeople and asked them 3 questions. What they were capable of, what they were afraid of, and whether they'd do what he asked without asking why. Almost all of them said yes, which probably surprised him, though he didn't show it. He set Ope Pelletier behind the locked front counter of the dry goods, with 2 rifles from the cabinet and instructions not to come out unless he saw the stranger come through the door first. He put Elias Drum and his Henry on the 2nd floor of the livery, with a window looking down the main street. He put Clara Fenner, and both boys and old Gus and Reverend Casterly in the livery's back room, which was warm from the animals and had a door that bolted from the inside, and 2 exits, and he told them to stay there regardless of what they heard. Maren Ault he left in the double arch, because it was her place and because she told him flatly that she wasn't leaving it, and because she had a double-barrel shotgun behind the bar that she knew how to use and was prepared to. Then he sat down and waited. Waiting was not the same as doing nothing. He did a thing in those 2 days that the townspeople noticed, but didn't fully understand at the time. He went around to every household and business remaining in Greystone Flats, just himself walking through the snow, knocking on doors. He spent 10 minutes with each family. He didn't tell anyone what to expect. He told them where to go and when, and he told them to stay there and not come out, and he told them they'd done hard things this winter already and they could do this too. With old Gus Fenner, who was difficult and suspicious and had a tendency to argue, he simply listened for 5 minutes until the old man ran down and then said, "Your grandsons are the bravest people I've met in this valley, and they take after somebody." Gus thought about that and stopped arguing. with Sylvie Pelletier, who was still not quite well and who had 2 small daughters watching her with enormous eyes. He crouched down to the girls' level and asked them their names and whether they were good at being quiet. They said they were. He said he believed them. Sylvie Pelletier had not cried in 3 months. She'd decided crying used up resources she couldn't spare. She cried for about 30 seconds after the door closed behind him, and then stopped and went to make sure the girls knew where the bolt was on the livery door. That was the kind of man he was, in between the other kind. He also, during those 48 hours, had 3 conversations with people who surprised him. The first was with the young Fenner boy, Arnie, who'd made the canyon run and come back without apparent trauma, and was now helping Elias Drum muck out the stables with the relaxed competence of a kid who'd been useful and knew it. The stranger watched him work for a while and then asked him how he'd felt out there on the ice at 2 a.m. Arnie thought about it. Cold, he said, and went back to mucking. The second was with Reverend Casterly, who came to find him the morning of the 2nd day and sat down and didn't say anything about God or salvation, or what men owe each other in a moral sense. He just said, "I want you to know that whatever happens in the next day, we understand what you're doing and why. Nobody here expects to come out of this clean." He paused. "Including you, I suspect," and he went back to the livery. The third was with Maren Ault, late on the 2nd night, when the storm had dropped to something survivable and they were sitting by the stove in the back room of the Double Arch, with cups of coffee going cold between them. She asked him, not out of prying, but in the way someone asks when they think they've earned the answer, what happened on the Cimarron Trail that made his name. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "Nothing happened on the Cimarron Trail. A lot of things happened, and one man happened to be the one standing between them and something they couldn't finish." She waited. "I had a family once," he said. "Long time back. Town like this one, further south. There was trouble, and I wasn't there to stop it. I was off working somebody else's problem." He paused. "I came back, and there wasn't much to come back to." He turned his coffee cup in his hands, the same gesture she'd noticed the first night. "I decided I'd rather be in the way of that kind of trouble than not in the way of it. That's all it was. That's all it's ever been." Maren looked at him for a moment. She said, "That's enough of a reason." He said, "It's the only one I've got." That was all they said about it. He finished his coffee and went to check the sight lines one more time, and she stayed by the stove, and the snow ticked against the window glass in the quiet. Cord Jessup brought the remaining riders in a day early. There was a reason for that which came out later in the marshal's interviews. One of the 6 men who'd turned east on the main road, the young one, the 19-year-old, had left the Draper Ranch the previous evening and ridden to Greystone Flats alone, arriving late, and gone to find the stranger at the Double Arch. He'd stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and told the stranger his name, which was Perry Boone, and said that Cord Jessup was planning to ride in at first light, a day early, hoping to catch the town before it was ready. He'd said he didn't feel right about not saying something, and then he'd turned around and ridden east again into the dark. The stranger had stood looking at the closed door for a moment after Perry Boone left. Maren, watching from behind the bar, had asked what he was thinking. He said, "That kid's going to be all right." She said, "I thought you figured he would be." He said, "I hoped. Now I know." He went and told Elias Drum, and they each got 3 more hours of sleep before the dawn, which in the circumstances was a gift worth having. The stranger had figured 2 days. What he got was dawn on the 2nd day, the shape of 9 riders coming in from the east road, just visible through the white air as the early light began. He'd been up since 3. He was standing in the doorway of the Double Arch with the coffee Maren had poured him, watching the road, and he saw them at the same moment. Elias Drum's signal whistle came from the livery loft. 9 riders. He counted them twice. He put the coffee down on the porch rail. He rolled his shoulders once, that settling motion, and he walked out into the middle of the street. Cord Jessup saw him from 50 yards and reined up. The riders behind him bunched, reading the situation. A single man standing in the middle of the road in the early cold, waiting the kind of stillness that is its own kind of statement. Jessup was a rangy man in a dark coat with a face like old leather, and he'd been doing this long enough to read what he was looking at. He walked his horse to maybe 30 yards. He stopped. "You're the one that shot Silas," he said. "Not a question." "I am," the stranger said. "Then you know what comes next." "I know what comes next for you," the stranger said. "What I'm telling you is that it doesn't have to come next for all of them." He let that sit for a moment. The riders behind Jessup shifted. A couple of horses moved. "Listen to me," the stranger said, pitching his voice to carry the whole line. "3 of you are going to ride into this street, and it's going to go the way it's going to go. The rest of you don't have to be here for it. Your boss is dead. Your arrangement is done. There's no more money, no more protection, no reason to ride into a fight you didn't pick with a man you haven't met. You ride east right now. You're free men." Silence. The wind moved through the street. Snow sifted off the eave of the livery. One of the riders, the young one, the 19-year-old with the bad decision in his past, turned his horse sideways without a word. Then another. A third man said something under his breath, and a fourth turned his horse too. Cord Jessup said, "Any man who rides out of here rides out yellow. Any man who rides east of here gets to grow old," the stranger said. "You can call that what you want." 4 more riders turned, 6 in total, peeling out of the line, not looking back, moving east at a walk that became a trot and then something faster, including the young one, including, to the stranger's small surprise, one of the 3 he'd marked as hard cases, the trail drifter, the one whose name nobody knew, who'd apparently done his own arithmetic and arrived at a different answer than Jessup. That left Cord Jessup, the young killer trace, and Dobe, who was exactly the size and disposition of trouble. 3 against 1. Jessup said, "Well then?" "Well then," the stranger agreed. What happened in the street of Greystone Flats on the morning of January 17, 1887, was brief and decisive, and not clean. That's the honest account of it. The stranger was hit. A graze along the outside of his left forearm. Trace's shot going wide by 3 inches that cold air and Trace's nerves accounted for, and he bled onto the frozen mud of the main street while the thing played out. Doby went down fast, the shot that brought him choosing to clip his gun hand first, which the stranger had aimed for, because Doby had the fastest hands of the 3, and the stranger had studied him through Maren's descriptions for 2 full days. Trace panicked when Doby went down and made a run for it instead of following through, and the shot that stopped him was aimed for the shoulder, which is where it hit. Cord Jessup fired twice, accurate, and both shots went through the air where the stranger had been standing half a second earlier. The third shot was the stranger's second, and it ended it. 3 men down, all breathing, none of them likely to run anywhere in the near future. Elias Drum came down from the livery with his Henry. Oak Pelletier opened the dry goods door. Maren Ault came out of the double arch and looked at the stranger standing in the middle of the street, blood dark on the arm of his coat, and she came and looked at his arm. "That needs wrapping," she said. "I know it does," he said. She wrapped it. He sat at the bar while she did it, and he didn't say much, and neither did she, because sometimes there isn't much to say after a thing like that, just the ordinary business of going on. Elias Drum came in from the street, took off his hat, and sat down. He looked at the 2 men on the ground. Outside, the door was open to the cold air, and he said, "I'll send for Doc Hayward in Gallatin City once the trail clears." He paused. "He's a day's ride out, but he's good. They'll live," the stranger said. He was looking at his arm with clinical attention, the way a man evaluates a repair job rather than an injury. "I know they'll live," Elias said. I mean for Trace. His shoulder's going to give him trouble the rest of his life if it sets wrong." The stranger looked up at that. He and Elias Drum looked at each other for a moment. "Send for the doctor," the stranger said. "I was going to," Elias said, and poured himself a whiskey without being asked, and drank it standing staring out the window at the clean, cold morning. Maren finished the bandaging with neat, efficient knots that the stranger recognized as the work of someone who'd done it before. He asked quietly how many times she'd had to patch someone up in 18 months. She said 3. He asked who. She said, "Gus Fenner, after the incident with the mule." A ranch hand named Peck, who'd made the mistake of defending his employer's property too loudly in the street, and gotten a broken rib for it. And herself. Once. A cut from a broken glass that had happened accidental, but only because one of Vane's men had swept his arm across the bar in a way that wasn't quite accidental, if you understood his meaning. The stranger held still while she tied off the last knot. He said, "You should have been running a law office," she said. "I'll take that as a compliment." He said it was one. 3 days later, Gideon Cross arrived at the Territorial Marshal's office in Gallatin City. He walked through the door with the oilskin package under his arm and the look of a man who'd had a hard 3 days and intended to be paid in coffee and a good meal before he talked to anyone. The marshal on duty, a man named Eli Beckett, read the first 6 pages of the ledger and sent a telegram to Helena inside the hour. 12 marshals rode into Greystone Flats 14 days after that, in time to take custody of Cord Jessup, who'd recovered enough to be transported, and Trace, whose shoulder would heal badly, but heal. Dobie had died 2 days after the fight, not from the shot, but from a fever that the cold had let in, and nobody said much about that. The 6 riders who'd turned east on the Main Street Road were tracked down over the following months. 3 found work on honest ranches. 2 turned themselves in when the warrants went public, and the 19-year-old was found in Missouri, gave himself up without argument, and served 3 years for the extortion charges. He was the only one of Vane's men who ever wrote a letter to the town after the fact. Maren Ault kept it in the ledger between the last 2 pages, which she thought was the right place for it. The ledger itself, 62 pages of careful documentation, 18 months of crimes in a woman's handwriting, was entered as evidence in the territorial court at Helena in the spring of 1887. 3 men were hanged on its testimony. Silas Vane's mineral rights papers were found to be fraudulent, which surprised nobody, and the eastern ridge was released back to common use. Bill Draper came back to his ranch in April, found his land intact and his cattle mostly gone, and started over. He was back to full operation within 3 years, which he credited to stubbornness and the price of beef. The bridge toll operation cost the valley an estimated $11,000 over 18 months. The territorial court ordered restitution. About a third of it was ever actually paid, which was more than most people expected. Greystone Flats did not exactly thrive after the trial. Towns like that one rarely do. The population climbed back to 140 by 1890, then settled somewhere between 60 and 80 for the rest of the decade, as the railroad pushed through the next valley south and pulled most of the commerce with it. But it didn't die. It's still on the map, in its way one of those small places in the eastern Montana foothills that shows up as a dot with a name and nothing else. The kind of place you'd drive through without knowing anything about what happened there in the winter of 1887. The stranger stayed for 2 weeks while his arm healed and the trails opened up. He helped the Fenner boys patch the livery roof, which had taken damage in the storm. He played cards with Elias Drum most evenings, and lost more than he won, which Elias found inexplicably satisfying. He ate most of his meals at the Double Arch, and Maren Ault cooked for him, and they talked the way 2 careful people talk when they've come through something together, and aren't entirely sure what to do with the fact of each other. On the morning he was set to ride out, she made a pot of coffee and they sat on the front steps of the saloon in the cold, clear air, with the cups warming their hands. The snow had settled. The ridges were bright against the blue sky, that particular winter brightness that makes everything look like the world was just finished. "There's a city," she said, after a while. "Portland. I have a sister there. She's been writing me for 2 years." She looked at the ridges. "I've been telling myself I'd go when things were settled. Things are settled now." "Spring," he said. "Spring," she agreed. "You can't move in January, not here. But in April—" She paused. "There's more worth doing in a city, I think, than keeping a saloon in a valley nobody comes to." He nodded. "You could come back through Portland sometime," she said, not making it a question or an offer, just leaving it somewhere between them. He turned the coffee cup in his hands, that gesture she'd come to recognize. He looked at the ridges for a moment. "I might do that," he said. It wasn't a promise. They both knew it probably wasn't a promise, but it wasn't nothing either, and they left it there, in the cold, bright air, between the cups going warm. He finished his coffee, shook hands with Elias Drum, who gripped his hand with both of his, and with old Gus Fenner, who was tearful in a way he tried to disguise as having something in his eye. Arnie Fenner, the 10-year-old who'd walked the frozen canyon at 2 in the morning with an oilskin package, looked up at him without saying anything for a long moment, and then said, "You coming back?" The stranger looked at him. He said, "You never know." Arnie thought about that. He seemed to find it acceptable. The stranger stepped up into the saddle, turned north, and rode out toward the ridge without looking back. Not because there was nothing back there, because that's how that kind of man rides out of that kind of town, partner. Straight ahead into whatever comes next, carrying what he carries, putting it down where it needs to be put down. Maren Ault watched from the saloon steps until he was a dark shape against the snow. And then just the snow. She went back inside, poured the rest of the coffee down the drain, and started thinking about Portland. There's a thing this story keeps coming back to, if you sit with it long enough. Not the fast draw in a lamplight saloon, though that's the part people want to hear first. Not even the standoff in the street, 3 against 1 in the frozen morning air. The thing it comes back to is the woman at the table with the ledger. 18 months, every entry written in careful columns, in a hand that didn't shake, by a person who had made herself small enough to survive in a town being run by a man who'd taken everything and called it business. She hadn't run. She hadn't broken. She'd watched and documented, and waited and built the case. And when the right person walked through the door, she was ready to use it. The stranger was faster, but Maren Ault had done the work that made any of it matter. The ledger is what hanged 3 men and freed a valley. A gun is just a tool. 62 pages of a woman's handwriting, that's a different kind of force entirely. The old-timers used to say the West was won by men with rifles, partner. They weren't wrong, exactly, but it was kept. The parts worth keeping, the fields that got planted, the towns that made it past the first decade, the records that actually changed what happened in a courthouse. Those parts were kept mostly by people who wrote things down and held on and didn't give up on the idea that the law, even when it was far away and slow, was worth the trouble of reaching for. Maren Ault left for Portland in April of 1887. The double arch went to Elias Drum, who ran it for 4 more years before his knees gave out and he sold it to a young couple from Nebraska. He talked about those 2 weeks in January for the rest of his life, which was considerable. Elias Drum died in 1901 at 84 years old, still playing cards, still winning more than he lost. Nobody ever got the stranger's name. They called him the man from the North Fork Trail. For a while, then they just called him the Drifter. By the time the Helena newspapers ran the story of the trial in the spring, some creative editor had given him a different name entirely, and the name stuck in the retelling the way names do when someone needs a hook for a story. He never came back to Greystone Flats. Whether he came back through Portland is a question the record doesn't answer, and maybe that's right. Some stories are better with an open door at the end of them. He rode north into whatever came next. That's enough, folks. That's the whole of it. If you made it to the end of this one, you're the kind of listener I'm making these for, and I'm genuinely grateful. Subscribe if you haven't already. There are more stories like this. One, from the same corners of the real West, every week. And if you know someone who'd sit still for a good story told by firelight, send this one their way. They'll thank you for it. Take care out there, partner. I'll see you in the next one.